The classic French folk tale called Barbe Bleue, or Bluebeard, tells the story of a wealthy and powerful man who was married 6 times to women who have mysteriously disappeared. His 7th wife discovers the corpses of her predecessors, and just as Bluebeard is about to kill her too, she is saved by her brothers. The wife inherits his fortune, lays his former lovers to rest, and remarries a much less homicidal man. The story of Bluebeard has been retold hundreds of times in literature, theatre, and even film since it was first written down and published in 1697. But one adaptation of the horrific tale played out in real life during the turn of the 20th century. If you only feel toward me as I feel, and could bring 1/2 your love to me as I to you, how lucky I would be. If you could wed your heart to mine for the rest of our days, I would be the luckiest man alive. Those are the words a woman named Johanna read in a letter from her would-be future husband. Johanna had been corresponding with her wordsmith from San Francisco for weeks, awaiting his arrival in Chicago so the pair could, presumably, wed. But when a letter to her beau sent in her care from another woman, signed with X's and O's, appeared in her letterbox, Johanna's heart sank. When the man arrived in Chicago, she refused his proposal promptly. It was quite good luck for Johanna. If her pen friend had his way, the rest of her days would have been very few indeed. Her correspondent was none other than Johann Otto Hoch, better known as the Bluebeard murderer. Hoch was born Jakob Schmidt in Hohweiler, Germany, around 1855. During his life in Europe, he tried his hands at several jobs, most notably working in several chemist shops where he developed a deep knowledge of drugs and poisons. He married, and he and his wife had several children before he upped sticks and deserted them and fled to the United States. It's possible that Schmidt arrived in the States as early as 1883, but he claimed he immigrated in 1895. That was the same year he turned up in Wheeling, West Virginia, calling himself Jakob Huff. In Wheeling, he opened a saloon that catered to the local German population with beer, zither music, and traditional drinking songs. Reverend Herman C. A. Huss noticed that Huff spent much time pandering to the wealthy German-speaking widows who were members of Huss's congregation. Ultimately, he wooed a middle-aged widow named Caroline Hoch, and the couple were married in April. 3 months after exchanging vows, Caroline died following a horrific illness. In her last days, Reverend Huss was summoned to her bedside, where he observed the man he knew as Jakob Huff treating his wife with a white powder. Caroline seemed afraid of him and was reluctant to take the medicine he offered. Huss was so sure that Caroline was being poisoned by her husband that he asked a local physician to examine her. But when he and Dr. Ackerman returned to the sick room, Huff turned them away, insisting that his physician, Dr. Ford, was managing her medical care. Not wanting to overstep his boundaries and interfere with the work of another physician, Ackerman bowed out politely. However, he was greatly concerned by the woman's condition. Her hands were swollen, her stomach distended, and she vomited continuously. The following day, Caroline Hoch died. Her new husband cleaned out her bank account, sold their house, collected her life insurance benefits, and disappeared. Reverend Huss never believed that Jakob Huff had committed suicide, as the clothing and small personal effects left deserted on a riverbank pointed to. So when a musician visiting the church told him he had seen Huff in Janesville, Ohio, with a woman on his arm, Huss knew his suspicions were correct. For years, the clergyman followed his target's movements through obsessive newspaper reading. There was a clipping about a man named Otto Hoch who married a woman in Dayton, Ohio, only to desert her days later, taking her entire life savings with him. In 1897, there was a story describing a Cincinnati woman's death 3 months after marrying a zither player. Another announcing the marriage of a Jakob Otto Hoch in Milwaukee. In 1898, Haas read an account of Martin Dutz in Chicago who had been arrested for bigamy and swindling a used furniture dealer. The description printed of the crook matched the man he had known as Jakob Hoff to a T. The Reverend wrote to the Chicago police explaining the strange death of Caroline Hoch and sharing his suspicions that Martin Dutz and Jakob Hoff were one and the same. He included a photo of Hoff that had been left behind on the riverbank in Wheeling. The letter and picture were turned over to Inspector George Shippey. Shippey showed the photo to the man calling himself Martin Dutz, who admitted it was his, but denied ever being in Wheeling. The inspector also interviewed the used furniture dealer who had brought charges against Dutz. He informed the officer that he had sold furniture to the man several times, each for furnishing a new flat with a different bride. The furniture dealer told Shippey that he had even attended the funeral of one of his client's wives, Mrs. Julia Steinbecker. Steinbecker had died just 2 months after their wedding, and her family had attempted to stop the funeral to have her remains examined for signs of poisoning. The information Inspector Shippey collected was enough to convince the Chicago police that they likely had a serial killer on their hands. But with little physical evidence to tie Martin Dutz to his suspected crimes, they had to turn elsewhere for help. The chief of detectives wrote to Haas and confirmed that their bigamist, a criminal whose most often used alias was some iteration of Johann Otto Hoch, was likely swindling and possibly killing wealthy widows in Chicago. They advised Haas to pursue an indictment in Wheeling by presenting his evidence and their letter to the state's Attorney General. On November 14, 1898, the body of Caroline Hoch was exhumed for autopsy, but her vital organs had been removed, and with them, all possible traces of poison. In 1900, Johann Hoch was taken to Wheeling to face a murder charge, but without proof of poisoning, the case was hopeless. Hoch was freed due to lack of evidence. Perhaps now feeling invincible, he headed straight to Argos, Indiana, where he began courting Mrs. Mary Schultz. He told the widow he was a millionaire druggist from Chicago named Albert Buschberg. After they married, Hoch collected the $2,000 life insurance policy on Mary's late husband and moved his new bride and her 15-year-old daughter Nettie to Chicago. Soon she and her mother disappeared, along with all their savings. In 1901, Hoch married and buried a Mrs. Lufkin in San Francisco, then began courting the widow's daughter, who had inherited the family bakery. All the while, he was also writing to a woman in New York, engaged to a woman in St. Louis, and penning love letters to another in Chicago. He seemingly had a never-ending list of potential victims, adding to his roster faster than he could cross names off. That same year, he took a mail-order course in hypnotism and was certified as a graduate hypnotist. He had no plans to use his new skill to help anyone but himself. Instead, he went to work on a widow named Marie Elizabeth Girk, who he'd met through an advertisement in a Chicago newspaper. He would often place ads in German-speaking newspapers, announcing himself as a wealthy but lonely man who was in want of a wife to complete his life. He married Mrs. Girk 3 weeks after they first met and attempted to hypnotize her into taking out a large life insurance policy. Girk proved to be made of sterner stuff than he had anticipated, though, and in the end, he packed his bags and left. Marie had perhaps unknowingly had a close escape. This setback did little to deter the serial bigamist and murderer, however. As Count Otto von Kern of Bavaria, he swindled a widow out of $3,000 in St. Louis. Then, as Josh Schultz, he married a woman in St. Paul, took out a life insurance policy on her, and buried her within 2 months. In 1903, he took on the name Dr. G.L. Hart and married a burlesque queen in Milwaukee. He attempted to chloroform her, but was forced to run when she fought him off. In November 1904, he returned to his favorite hunting ground, Chicago. Mrs. Marie Welker answered a personal ad he posted, married Hoch 9 days later, and fell ill shortly after. The physician treating her diagnosed the condition as nephritis, or inflammation of the kidneys. Of course, Hoch's treatment, which consisted of a mysterious white powder, did nothing to improve her condition. As Marie's health faded, her sister, Mrs. Emily Fisher, came to visit. Fisher was a widow who came bearing the offer of money to help with medical treatments. Hoch turned down the offer, but by offering large sums of cash, Emily had inadvertently added herself to his long list. He quickly befriended her, and soon Marie began to accuse the pair of having an affair whilst she lay dying. On January the 12th, 1905, exactly 1 month after she wed Hoch, Marie Welker died. Despite his weeping and claims that he would have spent his entire fortune to save her life, Hoch didn't mourn his wife for long. 4 days after she passed, he proposed to Emily Fisher, saying he would have waited 6 weeks if it weren't for Marie's insults and accusations before her death. He said it was sensible to marry immediately, open a hotel together, and rake in their fortune. Emily Fisher agreed. Less than a week after the ceremony, Hoch asked his new wife for $1,000 to clear up some business in the city so he could travel to Germany. He told her that his elderly father was in poor health and he would leave an estate worth $15,000 behind. Hoch needed to be there, he said, to ensure that he and Emily would be the ones to inherit the wealth. As soon as he received the money, he disappeared. With Hoch no longer clouding her judgment, Emily Fisher began questioning the unusual circumstances of her sister's death. She went to the police to express her concern and was taken to the desk of Inspector George Shippey. On January the 22nd, 1905, Mrs. Marie Welker's body was exhumed. The autopsy showed a clear culprit, arsenic poisoning. This time, Shippey had the proof he needed, but no Hoch. The case was turned over to the press, who published the story of the bigamist poisoner with glee. Ex-wives and the relatives of his victims emerged to tell their stories to the police and reporters. On January the 30th, Mrs. Catherine Kimmerle was riding the trolley to downtown Manhattan when she noticed a familiar face staring out from the front pages of the newspaper the passenger opposite had unfurled. The caption called him the Bluebeard murderer, but Mrs. Kimmerle knew him as Henry Bartels, the man who had just rented a room from her and then immediately proposed marriage. She notified the police, who sent a team of 4 detectives to arrest Hoch in his room at the boarding house that night. Amongst his belongings were a loaded revolver and a hollow fountain pen crammed with over 50 grams of arsenic. Some estimates place the number of murders Johann Otto Hoch was responsible for at more than 50, though he would only be charged with one, that of Marie Welker. On May the 19th, 1905, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. The drama didn't quite end there, however. His execution was delayed several times after a woman named Cora Wilson came forward with money to fund an appeal against the ruling. She was aided in this defense of Hoch by an unlikely source, Emily Fisher. Though she was key to his arrest and conviction for the murder of her sister, Emily suddenly became his staunchest supporter. Despite the mountain of evidence and testimonies of other victims who had come forward in the meantime, she claimed her testimony had been coerced out of her by police. These claims were battered away by the judges who heard her appeal, and an increasingly desperate Emery threatened to take her own life if Hoch was to swing. Her threats proved hollow, and Hoch faced the gallows at Chicago's county jail on February 23, 1906. Newspapers reported his final words were, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. I must die an innocent man. Goodbye." As the trapdoor opened beneath him, Johann Otto Hoch descended into the annals of history, leaving behind a chilling legacy as one of the most prolific and enigmatic serial killers to have haunted the United States. Thank you for watching. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, "Well, I never."